joined today by Senator Tracy Pennycuick. You are proposing legislation that involves voter ID. What is the concept of voter ID?
So Pennsylvania is such a unique state. We have 67 different counties, and they all do things a little differently in the election process. So voter ID would bring a little bit of uniformity to that process. And why is voter ID important? Listen, 74% of Pennsylvanians want voter ID. 77% of our independent voters want voter ID. This is something that I think will bring more confidence to the election process. And because it's a constitutional amendment, that decision is going to go back to the voters. And that's critical. I think that is so important. Listen, we're going to have to pass it in 2 consecutive sessions in both the House and the Senate. And then the next time we go to vote, it'll be on the ballot. And that gives the voters of Pennsylvania the power to make that decision. And I think that's so important.
This legislation would create an amendment to the state constitution. When was the last time the Pennsylvania Constitution was amended?
Ooh, good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. Gosh, I don't know.
You mentioned the issue going to the voters. Is that how, for people who don't know, how the Constitution is amended? It becomes, once it passes the House and Senate, it goes to the people?
That is correct. That is how we amend our Constitution. And, you know, when you think about it, that is so important. Yes, you have an elected official in office, but for important issues like this, it's so important to bring it back to the people because we are amending our Constitution. So it's very, very critical that they be part of the process.
How would voter ID impact elections in Pennsylvania going further?
So you have to show an ID to register to vote. Now, when you go up to sign the book, you would have to show an ID. Now, I've heard many people say, oh, well, what about those that don't have an ID? And I want to read to you some of the forms of ID that we are accepting in Pennsylvania right now. And we're meeting with stakeholders to make sure, hey, we are capturing everyone in our population, from Amish and Mennonite that may not have a traditional ID to our seniors. So in Pennsylvania, you can have a Pennsylvania driver's license or a PennDOT ID card, which is free, by the way, an ID issued by any Commonwealth agency, an ID issued by the U.S. government, a U.S. passport, a military ID, a student ID, here's a big one, an employee ID. So if you work at my favorite place in the world, Asher's Chocolate, you can show your Asher's Chocolate ID card to vote. Also, if you don't have a photo ID, no worries, we've got you covered too. We're going to do your voter registration card that's issued from your county, a non-photo ID issued by the U.S. government, a non-photo ID by any agency in the Commonwealth or U.S. government. And that could be your license to fish. Crazy. A firearms permit or your current utility bill, a current bank statement, a paycheck or a government check. So, and if you're like my mom, who's in an assisted living facility, your ID card for that facility is also accepted. We have literally spanned, I think, every category in Pennsylvania. We have made that list so inclusive, and we want to make sure that we are not missing anybody. So we're still reaching out to stakeholders. We have not finalized the language of the bill because we want to make sure that everyone is okay with this bill, that this truly becomes part of our fabric of Pennsylvania voter ID.
How many states require voter ID for people at the polls?
So 35 states in Pennsylvania, and that is wonderful. Here's something that's going to kind of, I think it gave me pause. I hope it gives you pause. Canada requires a photo ID issued by the country of Canada. Mexico requires an ID and biometric data. So whether that's your fingerprint or an iris scan, I do not know, but I thought that was very, very interesting. All 27 countries of the EU require photo ID. So this is not a new concept. It's not unique to Pennsylvania. It's not unique to the United States. It is a worldwide thing, if you will. And I think as people move, we're much more of a mobile society than we were 100 years ago. I think it's just kind of the next step. I think it's a natural progression.
You mentioned about 70% of people in Pennsylvania are for voter ID. How was that number determined? Yeah, how was that number determined?
Let me look at my notes and I will tell you. It was the Franklin and Marshall College did a study in June of 2021. So I wanted to make sure I had my reference right. And
since that many people, are for it, what is holding up the legislature for passing it? What is the reasoning?
We've heard a lot of reasons why people are not behind voter ID. And honestly, I think those are myths. A lot of people say it will disenfranchise voters. It does not. I think there's a lot of people that, say, well, you're looking for a problem to solve. No, this is what our voters want. This is what our constituencies want. And you know what? We need to listen to those constituencies. This is what they want to feel more confident in the process. Then we need to give it to them to make the decision.
Have you spoken to people like Secretary of the Commonwealth, Al Schmidt, or county election employees, and what were their thoughts on this?
So county election employees want this. They get asked all the time when people come up to vote, why don't you need my ID? And I think, honestly, it would just kind of put the question to rest when we have voter ID. And the nice thing about it, again, as I said previously, the voter gets to decide. We put that power back in the hands of the voter to make the constitutional amendment. And I think as a legislature, we need to pass this voter ID bill so it can go to the people. There's no reason why we shouldn't get this passed in the House and Senate.
What have your colleagues in the Senate said about this bill?
I have a lot of support in the Senate about this bill. They're hearing from the same, their constituents as well that say, hey, everyone else has it. Why don't we have it? So I think there's a lot of support.
Where is this bill in the legislative process currently?
So we have not put out language yet. We are still working with stakeholders to iron out some fine details. We want to make sure that this bill is acceptable to as many people as possible. So every time there's a question or a concern, we address that. We're meeting with stakeholders. We're meeting with groups that potentially could not get an ID. And I have a community in Pottstown that doesn't have a driver's license center there. So how do we get them a driver's license? Well, we had the conversation. You don't have to have an ID card. You can use your utility bill. You can use your bank statement. And that resolved a lot of issue. We also looked at the homeless. The homeless are getting IDs. So that, that takes that out of the equation. And the individuals that are providing the wraparound services for the homeless to get themselves back on their feet are helping them get their Social Security cards. And if they're veterans, their DD-214. So we're wanting to make sure that we are not missing any group of people in this. And we want to make it as easy as possible.
Moving on to another bill you sponsored, you and Senator Mastriano are reintroducing legislation to create educational opportunity accounts for military families. Can you explain what those are?
So that would be an opportunity to put your child in a different form of schooling, just because we move our kids all the time. The amount of moving that we do is crazy. My children moved 17 times. None of my kids graduated from the high school they started with as a freshman. In fact, 2 of my children went to 3 different schools when they were in high school. So sometimes when you move, you have a gap, a learning gap. This would provide the parents an opportunity to pick a school that better fits their educational needs where they are. Pennsylvania is home to the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle. Those students usually are here in their junior and senior year of high school, or high school at a minimum. And they're looking to go to college, but they may have educational gaps in that time period that they need to make up to be competitive for college. This gives those parents more of an opportunity to do what best fits their children.
What does the military education plan for children currently look like?
We actually don't have one. Now, we've done some great work in that space for children. Last year, my bill through the MIC3, the Military Compact for Children, allowed our reserves and National Guards to access the same benefits as active duty when they move around, which is great, but we do not recognize the challenges of a child who moves all the time. We've got to do that better. And our military, whether they are active duty or reserves or National Guard, I like to lump them all together because you do have to move if you're in the National Guard or Reserve and you want a promotion. So all those children that move all the time don't have the stability. So sometimes I have a child who cannot do fractions. Literally, she's a lawyer. She cannot do fractions because we moved and the school we went to had it in a lower grade. The school we came from had it in a higher grade. So she got lost in that shuffle. It's really important that we give these kids the opportunities that they need and their parents can track their educational process and do what's best for the child.
So what would that look like? You mentioned your daughter having the fraction gap. What would that look like to fill in the gap?
So if they need extra tutoring, if they need definitely extra tutoring. If they're perhaps missing a course. My children lived in Europe for 3 years. We came back, guess what? They didn't have American history. You need American history to graduate, but they had European history down pat. So do they need an extra course along the way to fill those requirements for graduation? Some schools do it really well working with military families. Others are not so familiar with military families and sometimes the gaps in coverage. So it could be extra tutoring. It could be an extra course here or there. But it helps those parents figure out what they need.
Would there need to be extra funding to pay for the tutors or things like that? And where would that funding come from?
That would come through the local school district.
Do other states have EOAs?
There are several that have EOAs, and it's important because when you think about it, look at our huge military installations down in the South, Fort Benning, and I apologize, I don't know the new names. I'm a little bit out of the military vernacular at the moment, but Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, they are thousands upon thousands of children that are being educated, but those parents move and then they come back. So those school districts have already kind of taken it upon themselves to fill those gaps of those children. And that's really important.
How did you and Senator Mastriano come up with the idea for this bill?
It was real easy. We both have kids that, we move them around all the time. And, you look at your kid and you love your kid and you go, oh gosh, we missed this. We've got to fill that in. So just from our own experiences of moving back and forth to Europe and all over the United States and recognizing that, the toll it takes on our children, when you don't have that stability in your educational process, that's a challenge. You go to a new school, they have a different way of teaching, they have a different curriculum, and that is a challenge. And it makes our military children very, very resilient. But we need to acknowledge that sometimes they get lost a little bit in that shuffle.
Where is this bill in the legislative process currently?
So it has not been quite introduced yet. It is out on a co-sponsor memo. We hope to have it introduced in the next couple of months.
Lastly, Governor Shapiro just gave his annual budget address. What were your thoughts on some of his funding priorities for the next year?
Well, I'm going to steal Scott Martin's word, fantasy. We are starting off with a revenue stream that does not exist. Not only does it not exist, but he multiplied it by 3 and 5 times. So the first is legalized marijuana. It is not on the books. It is not a proposed legislation, but yet he's projecting this huge revenue stream. We all know that sin taxes do not carry that amount of money coming in. Additionally, he looked at taxing skill gains. We have 3 different bills in the pipeline, if you will. None of them are going to bring in that kind of revenue. Those 2 revenue streams right there, that's a huge problem because we're starting off, he's spending $3 million more than last budget cycle, and we're already starting off in the hole from overspending our budget. So if I ran my household budget like we run the state budget, I'd be in serious debt. And we cannot afford to be in serious debt. We need to reprioritize and take care of our seniors and take care of our school kids. Those are kind of the priorities. But also, we need to put more funding towards our intellectually disabled, our home health care providers that have not seen a raise in forever. We need to really relook at what we're doing. I do not personally believe that we need to be heating and cooling empty buildings that are on the state's rolls. We need to be giving those to the local redevelopment authority. And I do mean give. Those are taxpayer dollars. They should go back to the local redevelopment authority and let the local government decide what to do with those buildings, whether they make low-income housing, mixed housing, commercial. That's up to them. But we have got to stop wasting money. And that's really a big push. I am, as you know, on appropriations. And I think it's important that we look at every line item and say, is this value added to the residents of Pennsylvania? Because we're spending a lot of money on stuff that I don't think is value added. Empty buildings are not value added. Get them back on those tax rolls. Improve those local communities. We've had the Harrisburg State Hospital has been empty for 20 years. It's nuts. Why are we not giving that to Dauphin County Redevelopment Authority and, hey, put housing in there? We need housing in Harrisburg. Put companies in there. Make it mixed use. I mean, there's so many opportunities across the Commonwealth in these empty buildings. So that's one area. We're continuing to spend record amounts on education. What are we doing to make sure that our children can read and write? That's the most important part. Historic funding is great, only if you're showing that you are, in fact, educating our children to meet the standards. And I'm worried about that. More money doesn't always solve the problem. I've had the fortunate opportunity to see schools all over the country where my kids went, schools in Europe where my kids went, and schools in Afghanistan where girls had the old little chalkboards to learn to write on. Very, very minimal amount of investment, but they were learning to read and write. So I don't think money is always the answer. Sometimes it's a restructuring. Sometimes it's holding them to a standard that says these children have to read by a certain age. They have to be able to write a complete sentence. Math, I mean, we've got to get back to basics in Pennsylvania. We have an aging population. We need to take care of our vulnerable seniors. We've got to stop taxing them to the nth degree for our schools. We've got to find out a better way to do it. I worry about our seniors. I worry about the increasing cost of basic living requirements, gas, utilities, food, and then you add on to that real estate taxes. I think the governor missed the mark. I think the governor really needed to say, you know what? We are going to make sure that we are not raising taxes on the citizens of Pennsylvania, and we are going to clean our house up first. We're going to be focused on efficiency and effectiveness and saving our tax dollars. And one of the things that is a personal gripe of mine, if you're not working in a building that the state owns and you're working from home, give up that space. Why are we continuing to pay for all this space if you're working from home? And I think we need to relook at why we are working from home. Some jobs you can work from home, but others you can't. And I think we need to look at that. So I was I was disappointed. He tried to be everything to everyone, and you can't do that. You have to focus and lead from the front on what's best for the Commonwealth. And right now, what's best for the Commonwealth is realistic numbers for our budget.
One final thing on the budget. Transportation was a big part of it, and you represent an area that utilizes SEPTA. And for those who are not familiar, SEPTA did have some budget deficiencies last year. The governor proposed raising the amount of transit funding taken off of sales tax revenue to 9.43%, totaling about $292 million. How will that funding impact your constituents who rely on SEPTA for transportation?
So before we talk about funding SEPTA, I proposed a bill along with Senators Tartaglione, Pocosi, and Ferry that would increase the penalties for assault on a rider or an employee of mass transit. And that's the first issue. We have got to make mass transit safe for both the employee and the rider. That is non-negotiable. That is a huge problem. Recently, we've had several assaults, but we've also had a murder, and our bill is named after the gentleman, Bernie Goddard, who was murdered as a SEPTA employee. That is unacceptable behavior. So that's the first thing, is we've got to make mass transit safe for both employees and riders. Second, we need to relook and do a deep dive on what routes maybe we could scale back on, what routes maybe we need to expand on, but we need to right-size SEPTA to the right routes and follow what our riders are doing. And I don't think we've done that effectively. Third, we need to cost share it better. It is not fair for the middle of the state to pay for mass transit when they're not using mass transit and they have no access to mass transit. So does that mean that the 5 counties that surround Philadelphia, do we look at how we can do this better? I think that's a local issue. I don't think that's a statewide issue. I think for SEPTA, we need to get the 5 collar counties that are using that mass transit to figure it out better. Do we need to have increased fares? Do we need to have an increased tax? That I don't know. But before we look at increasing taxes, we need to look at our ridership, the routes, the most effective use of those limited dollars now.
Senator Tracy Pennycuick, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. It was great to see you. And don't forget, go Eagles.